In this lesson, we're going to build a file utility class. So we know that we can do things like file get contents, and then there's also file put contents. But what about when you want to, rather than replacing a file entirely, you want to add to a file? Well, that will require a specific setting. What about when you want to get the file size? Or what if you want to get the extension? Or what if you want to determine whether the file exists? With the native PHP, really we're just limited to lots of functions, which really isn't ideal and it's not very expressive. So let's build a file class that will make this a lot easier. For example, rather than using file get contents, we're going to use file, and that's a lot more expressive. All right, let's get started. We begin, of course, with the class file. So what's the most basic thing that we can do with a file? Well, we can determine whether it exists. So let's do that one first. We're going to make these static methods, and that way we also don't have to instantiate. Okay, public static function, and this one will be called exists. Now, how can we determine whether a file exists? Well, it's really easy. We just use the function file exists, and we pass in the name of the file. So let's make sure that we accept that as an argument. Good. So now I'm going to create another file, and this will be how we confirm that it does work. So what I'll do in here is require file.php, and now I will run echo file exists, and let's just give it some file that we know doesn't exist, like that. All right, let's view that in the browser. So if I run this, we're going to get nothing at all. So why don't we just do this really quickly? Echo file exists, it does, otherwise it does not, just so we can get some visual feedback. And now we can see, of course, it does not. But if I create the file, and now I run it, we do get it does. Okay, so our first method is working exactly like we would hope. Good. Let's continue on to the next one. So what's the next thing that we would like to do? Well, maybe we should be able to determine what the size is of a file. All right, public static function, size for the file, and now I'm going to return file size file. And this is one of the things that you'll get irritated with PHP. For example, with file exists, there's an underscore. With file size, there's not. And these are some of the things that really irk people. But if you create these helpful utility classes, you can kind of work around that so it's not as much of an issue. And let's try that one. So echo file size file.php. Run it, and we get 163. Good. So now we have the ability to determine whether a file exists. We can capture its size. Let's also figure out what the name of the file is. This can be helpful. Public static function name. So you'll pass it the name of a file, and it's going to return what the name is minus the extension. Now, if you can't remember how to do this, refer back to our file chapter, and you'll remember that we can return path info for the file, and we specifically want path info file name like that. While we're here, let's also do another one that will get the extension like that. And that will be just about the same thing, but in this case, return file, path info, extension like that. All right, let's try these out. So echo file, extension, run it, and we get PHP, good. If I do file.txt, we get txt, so that's working great. And let's also make sure we have the file name, which is file, great. So already we're creating a more expressive environment. By using this utility class, it's a lot easier. You're not having to remember these silly function names. You just do it how you would expect. File size, file name, file extension. So what else? What about deleting a file? Okay, public function, and this should be static, of course, and we will call it delete. And the way we delete a file is by using unlink. So we will return unlink file, just like that. Let's try it out. Echo file, delete, and let's just add sample.txt and make sure that we create that. There we go. So if we did everything right, when we run it, this file will be deleted. Run it, we get 1 for true, which means that the file was deleted, and sure enough, it is gone. So again, notice that we're doing this manual testing, and I've been coming back to this several times. There are ways that we can programmatically perform these tests. And that way, for example, every time you save, all of your tests will run. And that way, if you accidentally make a mistake and you delete something or you refactor a bit of code, when those automatic tests run, it'll let you know immediately, hey, you made a mistake here. Now that's beyond this course, but there will be test-driven development and PHP course that I want you to watch. All right, so let's create a couple more. What about returning the last time the file was updated? And this can be really helpful, for example, when caching a file. You can say, if this file was last updated less than 10 minutes ago, then ignore it. But if it has been more than 10 minutes, then we need to refresh the cache. So let's do that. Public static function last updated for the file. And with PHP, we can do that with the file mtime. And we'll pass that. There we go. All right, let's continue on. What are some of the other more popular ones? Well, you will want to fetch a file using file get contents. So public static function get file. So let's do this a simple way and then we'll slowly expand it. The first thing I see is we would just want to run file get contents on the file like that. Now, let's create sample.txt again and we'll say here is my file. And now I'm going to echo file get sample.txt and see if that works. Run it in the browser, and sure enough, we do get here is my file. But what if the file does not exist? So we run sample2.txt. Well, now if I run it, we're going to get a warning, failed to open stream because no such file exists. So that means we should do a check within our class. Rather than just automatically returning it, let's first determine whether the file exists. So we will say if, and you know what? We already have a method that will take care of it. And we can call this method by using static exists. So we're just calling a static method that is called exists. We're going to send through the file. And now we're saying if the file does exist, then return the contents. Otherwise, we'll return false. And we can improve upon this, but let's keep it like that for now. So now if I run it, notice that we don't get a warning. False is simply returned. But if the file does exist, we do fetch it. All right, let's refactor this now. Rather than doing it like this, let's return, and we'll use the ternary operator. Return static exists file. If that's the case, return file get contents file, and otherwise return false like that. Let's double test it to make sure it works. It does. We do a file that does not exist, and we get nothing. But what if we want to give the user the option to return a default value if the file does not exist? So for example, we can say get sample2.txt, but if it does not exist, then echo out a default value. Well, if we run that right now, we know that's not going to happen. But let's write the functionality to allow for that. So right here with our get method, we're going to add a second parameter for the default, and that's going to be null. Then, rather than returning false if the file does not exist, we're going to return the default value, like that. Now if I run it, notice we get the default value because the file does not exist. But if the file does exist, we get the contents of the file, and that's cool. All right, let's do maybe one or two more. Let's do one for adding content. So we would do file put contents. So let's call this public static function put to the file and the data. So we know that we're going to file put contents to the file and the data. And let's just try it like that and see what we get. And I'll make sure I return. All right, so now, right here, I will run file put to sample.txt. Here is some new data. Okay, so let's run that. And now if I open up sample.txt, here is some new data. But notice if I do it again, run it, sample.txt, we're overriding that file every single time, and that's just the way it works. But we can change this. If I go back to file.php, let's add a third parameter called append. And if this value is set to true, we're instead going to append to the file rather than override it entirely. Then we can do a quick test, and we'll say if append is set to true, then we're going to return file put contents to the file, to the data, and we're going to set a flag that specifies that we should append to the file. File append. I'm also going to pass another one that's lock ex, and that means the file can only be written to one at a time. And that way, for larger applications, you don't have to worry about maybe two people are writing to the file at the exact same time. For small applications, that will really be a non-issue, but it's good to have in there anyways. Now, if append is set to false, then we'll just leave it like that, and let's go ahead and add on the lock extension. So now let's try it. Back to index.php. We'll change this up. We know right now sample.txt, here's some new data again. But this time I'm going to set true so that it will append. One more time, run it, and now notice that that has been appended. And if you would like that on a new line, you can also use PHP end of line like that. Run it again, and now you'll notice that it is on its own line. One more time, there it goes. Now there's one thing though, this does work, but many times you can get in these situations where you're setting these true-the falsy values, which determines how the method behaves. And that can be difficult to remember 6 months down the line. So why don't we also, while we're here, add a convenience function, public static function append. And what this is going to do is simply call the put method and set the flag, but it's again more readable, it's more expressive. So return static put the file, the data, true. So I want you to note that this time we didn't rewrite this functionality. We didn't simply do something like this. Then we're duplicating your code. If you've ever heard of the dry technique, don't repeat yourself. Well, we've already written this functionality. So let's simply call the method and pass in the appropriate values. That way we get this helper method if people want to use it, and it's a low-cost helper. Let's try it. Change it, file, append to sample.txt, appending content. I will run it, and now you'll see at the end we do get appending content. Great. But now, what about when I want to clear a file? Well, there's a couple different ways that you can empty a file out. There is a PHP truncate function that you can run, or also there's this little technique that you may not know, is that when you open a file with write privileges, that will automatically clear it. So let's use that technique. Public static function truncate, and it's going to accept the name of the file. And let's open the file with write privileges. And we'll save that pointer to FP, which is file pointer. Now, because we've run that function alone with write, it will automatically clear the file. So that's all we need to do. Now I will close the file. But also we need to think about, what if somebody tries to truncate a file that doesn't exist? Well, that will try to create the file, and we don't want to do that. So let's do this. If static exists file, notice we're taking advantage of our own methods, then, and only then, should we open the file and clear it. All right, let's try it out. File, truncate, sample.txt. So if we did everything right, when we view this after refreshing the browser, that will be empty. Run it, come back, and now it is empty. And that's all the methods that we're going to do in this lesson, but this can be extremely helpful. If you're working on your own projects, this is absolutely a utility class that you can add straight away. Now, if you'd like to continue this on your own for some homework, see if you can implement methods for copying a file. So maybe you want to copy this file to another directory, and also moving a file. So maybe we want to move sample.txt to a different directory. See if you can figure out how to do that. Homework. Implement, copy, and move. And that will do it for this lesson.